Hi, it's me, Ingrid INFP, and we're going to be talking about To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, which I read, and I listened to the audiobook at the same time. I would say that To the Lighthouse is kind of like The Waves by Virginia Woolf. I would say that The Waves is more of her polished work, while To the Lighthouse is like the first draft of The Waves. I would say that they're both good, but To the Lighthouse is actually more about the sea than The Waves is, and the setting is very important in this book. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the quotes that happen here. What is important to know about both To the Lighthouse and The Waves is that the point of view switches quite often. And in The Waves, it's written kind of like in a soliloquy format with like, you know, how you have the theater with the name of the person talking and then the speech. Here, it doesn't say which point of view it is, it just switches. But it's actually surprisingly easy to follow. And so we follow the Ramseys, which is the Ramsey family. It's a couple who are in their 50s, I think, and they have 8 children. And it follows these people through time, but also it follows, in both The Waves and To the Lighthouse, there's a poet character called Lily in this book and Rhoda in The Waves. And the poet character is kind of like a self-insert for Virginia Woolf, kind of like on the outside, seeing things as like an artist would see them, and using their intuition to see a whole other perspective on the situation. Most of this book is from the poet's point of view, or from so Lily Briscoe, or from Mrs. Ramsey's point of view. Mrs. Ramsey is kind of like the mother, you know, the woman figure in the book. But sometimes it's from the children's point of view, and sometimes it's from the men's point of view. So this is from Mrs. Ramsey's point of view. And then a dreadful storm coming, and the windows covered with spray, and the birds dashed against the lamp, and the whole place rocking, and not be able to put your nose out of doors for fear of being swept into the sea? How would you like that? So she added, rather differently, one must take them whatever comforts one can. Mrs. Ramsey is a very practical sort of person. Then she is also really interested in having harmony with everyone. She says, strife, divisions, difference of opinion, prejudices twisted into the very fiber of being. Oh, that they should begin so early, Mrs. Ramsey deplored. They were so critical, our children. They talked such nonsense. It seemed to her such nonsense inventing differences when people, heaven knows, were different enough without that. The real differences, she thought, are enough, quite enough. Okay, then we go and here we talk about how the sea is both soothing and wild. So the monotonous fall of the waves on the beach, which for the most part beat a measured and soothing tattoo to her thoughts, and seemed consolingly to repeat over and over again, as she sat with the children, the words of some old cradle song, murmured by nature. I am guarding you. I am your support. But at other times, suddenly and unexpectedly, especially when her mind raised itself slightly from the task actually at hand, had no such kindly meaning, but like a ghostly roll of drums, remorselessly beat the measure of life. Made one think of the destruction of the island and its engulfment in the sea, and warned her whose day and slipped past the one quick doing after another that was all ephemeral as a rainbow. The sound made her look up with an impulse of terror. Then we get to Lily's artistic mind. Such she often felt herself, struggling against terrific odds to maintain her courage, to say, "But this is what I see, this is what I see," and so to clap some miserable remnant of her vision to her breast, which 1,000 forces did their best to pluck from her. And then they go on. And had much ado to control her impulse to fling herself, thank heaven she had always resisted so far, at Mrs. Ramsay's knee and say to her, but what could one say to her? "I'm in love with you?" No, that was not true. "I'm in love with this all," waving her hand at the hedge, at the house, at the children. It was absurd. It was impossible. One could not say what one meant, because she has a hard time expressing herself other than through her art. More descriptions of the sea, and then let's just skip a little bit. Then they talk. There's some beautiful metaphors, like the sunshine. The wings of a bird fold themselves quietly, and the blue of its plumage changes from bright seal to soft purple. Then we get to the Mr. Ramsay, and he says, if one thought of her simply as a woman, one must endow her with some freak of idiosyncrasy. Yeah, he's kind of dismissive to the women in his life, and also he always wants sympathy from the women in his life, which Lily is the only person to not give to him. Everybody else just caves in, especially Mrs. Ramsay. Which is unfortunate. And he's written books, like he's a true literary, while Mrs. Ramsay is kind of like a very just simple, practical person. But unfortunately, her children see that she's like all spent out because she's been giving herself all the time. So boasting of her capacities to surround and protect, there was scarcely a shell of herself left for her to know herself by. All was so lavished and spent. And James, the son, as he stood stiff between her knees, failed her rise in a rosy-flowered fruit tree laid with leaves and dancing boughs, into which the beak of brass, the arid scimitar of his father, the egotistical man, plunged and spoke, demanding sympathy. So yeah, basically she's being all spent by her husband. Then we talk about how Mrs. Ramsay used to be pretty and loved, and now she's just simple. She had been loved. She had been admired. She had entered rooms where mourners sat. Tears had thrown in her presence. Men and women too, letting go of the multiplicity of things, had allowed themselves with her the relief of simplicity. It injured her that he would shrink. It hurt her. And whatever. And then for all this desire of hers to give, to help, was vanity. For her own self-satisfaction was it that she wished so instinctively to help, to give, that people might say of her, "Oh, Mrs. Ramsay, dear Mrs. Ramsay, Mrs. Ramsay, of course," and need her, and send for her, and admire her. So, yeah, she's realizing that some of it is not really just her being self-sacrificing. But also, so she says, made aware of the pettiness of some part of her, and of human relations, how flawed they are, how despicable, how self-seeking at their best. Shabby and worn out, and not presumably, her cheeks were hollow, her hair was white. Any longer a sight that filled the eyes with joy. She had better devote her mind to the story of the fisherman and his wife, and so pacify that bundle of sensitiveness of her son James. So yeah, she just resigns herself to being like just a mom and nothing else, which is sad. But her husband also has problems. He says he felt despair even physically, yet lost none of his intensity of mind. And so to stand on his level edge, facing the dark of human ignorance, how we know nothing, and the sea eats away the ground we stand on. That was his fate, his gift. Then you talk about how life is like the sea. From being made up of little separate incidents, which lived one by one, became curled and whole, like a wave which bore one up with it and threw one down with it, there with a dash on the beach. Oh, sorry. And so Lily Briscoe says this, the poet. It paled beside this, so that she's looking at the rapture that Mrs. Ramsay has. It paled beside this rapture, this silent stare, for which she felt immense gratitude, for nothing so solaced her, eased her of the perplexity of life, and miraculously raised its burdens, as it's this sublime power, this heavenly gift, and one would no more disturb it while it lasted than break the shaft of sunlight lying level across the floor. So you can see how the description of the place kind of plays into how people's personalities are perceived. And then we talk about like how merging, like the sea merges everything into one. What device for becoming, like the waters poured into one jar, inextricably the same, one with the object one adored. Could body achieve it, or the mind, subtly mingling in the intricate passages of the brain, or the heart? Could loving, as people call it, made her and Mrs. Ramsay one? For it was not knowledge, but unity that she desired, not inscriptions on tablets, nothing that could be written in any language known to men, but intimacy itself, which is knowledge, she had thought, leaning her head on Mrs. Ramsay's knee. Then we talk about how Lily is scared of showing her pictures. One must. She braced herself to stand the awful trial of someone looking at her picture. One must, she said, one must. If it must be seen, Mr. Banks was less alarming than another. But that any other eyes should see the residue of her 33 years, the deposit of each day's living, mixed with something more secret than she had ever spoken or shown in the course of all these days, was an agony. At the same time, it was immensely exciting. And she talks a little bit about how she's painting. She might do it by bringing the line of the branch across so, or break the vacancy in the foreground by an object, James perhaps, so. But the danger was that by doing that, the unity of the whole might be broken. So it's kind of like the way that you see the world in this book is kind of like seeing this scene like a picture. So I like that. It's kind of like breaking the fourth wall in a way. Here it's Mrs. Ramsay. She took a look at life, for she had a clear sense of it there, something real, something private, which she shared neither with her children nor with her husband. A sort of transaction went on between them, in which she was on one side and life was another. She was always trying to get the better of it, as it was of her, and sometimes they parleyed when she sat alone. There were, she remembered, great reconciliation scenes, but for the most part, oddly enough, she must admit that she felt this thing that she called life terrible, hostile, and quick to pounce on you if you give it a chance. There were eternal problems, suffering, death, the poor. There was always a woman dying of cancer even here. And yet she said to all these children, you shall go through with it. To 8 people, her children, she had said relentlessly that the bill for the greenhouse would be £50. For that reason, knowing what was before them, love and ambition from being wretched alone in dreary places, she had often felt the feeling, when must they grow up and lose it all? And then she said to herself, brandishing her sword at life, nonsense. They will be perfectly happy. So I guess that is how it is to be a mother. It's like, you'll say like, oh, the world is terrible. But then at the same time, it's like, no, they will be perfectly happy. They can't be anything other than happy, you know? Then we talk about her self-effacing nature. To be silent, to be alone, all the being and the doing, expansive, glittering, vocal, evaporated, and one shrunk, with a sense of solemnity, to being oneself, a wedge-shaped core of darkness, something invisible to others. So she sheds herself in a way. It was odd, she thought, how if one was alone, one lent to things, inanimate things, trees, streams, flowers, felt they express one, felt they became one, felt they knew one, in the sense they were, felt an irrational tenderness thus. She looked at the long, steady light, as for herself, oneself. The room, she looked around it, was very shabby. There was no beauty anywhere. She forbore to look at Mr. Tansley. Nothing seemed to have merged. They all sat separate, and the whole of the effort of merging and flowing and creating rested on her. Again she felt, as a fact without hostility, the sterility of men. For if she did not do it, nobody would do it, and so, giving herself that little shake that one gives a watch that has stopped, the old familiar pulse began beating as the watch began ticking. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And so on, she repeated, listening to it, sheltering and fostering the still feeble pulse, as one might guard a weak flame with a newspaper. So she feels like it's her responsibility to take on this merging of creating harmony around her all the time, because nobody else is going to do it. This is Lily. She had done the usual trick. Be nice. She would never know him. He would never know her. Human relations were all like that, she thought. Inevitably, these were extremely insincere. They talk about love and how women and men have different ideas according to Virginia Woolf 100 years ago. There is a coherence in things, a stability. Something, she meant, is immune from change and shines out. She glanced at the window with its ripple of reflected lights, in the face of the flowing, the fleeting, the spectral, like a ruby. So that again tonight she had the feeling that she had once today already of peace, of rest. Of such moments, she thought, the thing is made that remains forever after. This would remain. So it's like the constancy of things, the change of things, like the ebb and flow of the sea. Then there's like this moment where she hung suspended. We have to go because there's way too much left. Then there's Mrs. Ramsay is really into the fruit on the table. Among the rich purples and the lowland grapes, then over the horny ridge of the shell, putting a yellow against a purple, a curved shape against a round shape. Without knowing why she did it, or why, every time she did it, she felt more and more serene. The words, she was looking at the window, sounded as if they were floating like flowers on water out there, cut off from them all, as if no one had said them, but they had come into existence by themselves. It was windy. for it was windy. She stood a moment to look out. It was windy, so that the leaves now and then brushed open a star, and the stars themselves seemed to be shaking in darkening light, trying to flash out between the edges of the leaves. Night, however, succeeds to night. The winter holds a pack of them in store and deals them evenly with indefatigable fingers. They lengthen, they darken. That's kind of how it feels like during the winter now. But the stillness and brightness of the day were as strange as the chaos and the tumult of night, with the trees standing there and the flowers standing there, looking before them, looking up, yet beholding nothing, eyeless and so terrible. As now the lighthouse kind of falls apart. Only the lighthouse beam entered the rooms for a moment, sent its sudden stare over bed and wall in the darkness of winter, looked with equanimity at the thistle and the swallow, at the rat and the straw. Nothing now withstood them. Nothing said no to them. Let the wind blow, let the poppy seed itself and the carnation mate with the cabbage. Let the swallow build in the drawing room, and the thistle thrust aside the tiles, and the butterfly sun itself on the faded chintz of the armchairs. Through the open window, the voice of beauty of the world came murmuring, too softly to hear exactly what it said. But what mattered if the meaning were plain? Going to the lighthouse. But what does one send to the lighthouse? Perished, alone. The green light on the wall opposite, the empty spaces. Such were some parts. How did it bring them together? She asked. So that's the thing, is like bringing the things together. And I think that Mrs. Ramsay and Lily both have a sense of that things need to be brought together in some kind of adjustment, but they are thinking about it in completely different terms. She should surrender herself to him entirely. And even if he had sorrows enough to keep her supplied forever, should leave her, should be diverted before it swept her down in its flow. Mr. Ramsay gets tired of women who say no to him. His age, his frailty, his desolation, when suddenly tossing his head impatiently in his annoyance. For after all, what woman could resist him? He noticed that his bootlaces were untied. And then he goes on to put on his boots. And so finally Lily says, "What beautiful boots." And so yeah, that satisfies him in the end, which is so stupid, but okay. Here it's about the artist starting her painting. She took her hand and raised her brush. For a moment it stayed there trembling in a painful but exciting ecstasy in the air. Where to begin? That was the question. At what point to make the first mark? One line placed on a canvas committed her to innumerable risks, to frequent and irrevocable decisions. All that an idea seemed simple became in practice immediately complex, as the waves shape themselves symmetrically from the cliff top, but to the swimmer among them are divided by steep gulfs and foaming crests. Still the risk must be run, the mark made. The brush descended, it flickered down over the white canvas, it left a running mark. A second time she did it, a third time, and so pausing and so flickering, she attained a dancing rhythmical movement, as if the pauses were one part of the rhythm and the strokes another, and all were related. Her mind kept throwing up from its depths scenes and names and sayings and memories and ideas like a fountain spurting over that glaring, hideously difficult white space, while she modeled it with greens and blues. So here we're talking about how the children and the father finally go out onto the sea. See the little house? Well, which was it? She could no longer make out, there on the hillside, which was their house. All seemed distant and peaceful and strange. The shore seemed refined, far away, unreal. Already the little distance that had sailed had put them far from it and given it the changed look, the composed look, of something receding in which one has no longer any part. Which was their house? She could not see it. Who knows what we are, what we feel? Who knows that even at the moment of intimacy, this is knowledge. Aren't things spoiled then? Mrs. Ramsay may have asked. By saying them? Aren't we more expressive thus? The moment at least seemed extraordinarily fertile. And this, Lily thought, is what we call knowing people, thinking of them, being fond of them. Not a word of it was true. She had made it up, but it was that she knew them all by all the same. She went on tunneling her way into the picture, into the past. Could it be, even for elderly people, that this was life? Startling, unexpected, unknown? I hope it is. The cliffs looked as if they were conscious of the ships, and the ships looked as if they were conscious of the cliffs, as if they signaled to each other some secret message of their own. Yeah, then we talk a little bit about James, who is just kind of a stubborn guy, but he's kind of against his father always deciding things all the time, which I'm all for. It says tyranny or despotism, he called it, making people do what they don't not want to do, cutting off their right to speak. How could any of them say, but I won't, when he said, come to the lighthouse, do this, fetch me that? She gazed over the sea at the island, but the leaf was losing its sharpness. It was very small, it was very distant. The sea was more important now than the shore. Waves were all around them, tossing and sinking, with a log wallowing down one wave, a gull riding on another. About here, she thought, dabbling her fingers in the water, a ship had sunk, she murmured, dreamily, half asleep, how we perished each alone. So much depends then, thought Lily Briscoe, looking at the sea, which had scarcely a sail on it, which was so soft that the sails and clouds seemed set in its blue. So much depends, she thought, upon distance, whether people are near us or far from us. So there's one of the children who's on the sea, looking at the shore and seeing everything blurred and distant, and Lily on the shore, looking out at the sea and thinking like about the distance and the relations between people. So coming back from a journey or after an illness, before habits had spun themselves across the surface, one felt the same unreality, which was so startling. Felt something emerge. Life was most vivid then. One could be at one's ease. A washerwoman with her basket, a rook, a red-hot poker, the purples and the grey-greens of flowers, some common feeling which held the whole together. It was some such feeling of completeness, perhaps, which 10 years ago, standing almost where she stood now, had made her way, that she must be in love with the place. Love had 1,000 shapes. What was the problem then? She must try to get hold of something that had evaded her. It evaded her when she thought of Mrs. Ramsay. It evaded her when she thought of her pictures. Phrases came, visions came, beautiful pictures, beautiful phrases. But what she wished to get hold of was that very jar of nerves, the thing itself before it had been made anything. Get that and start afresh. Get that and start afresh, she said desperately, pitching herself firmly again before her easel. It was a miserable machine, an inefficient machine, she thought, the human apparatus for painting or for feeling. It always broke down at the critical moment. Heroically, one must force it on. For the lawn was very rough, here sitting on the world, she thought, for she could not shake herself free from the sense that everything this morning was happening for the first time, perhaps for the last time, as a traveller, even though he is half asleep, knows, looking out of the train window, that he must look now, for he will never see that town, or that mule cart, or that woman at work in the fields again. The lawn was the world. They were up here together on this exalted station. So everything is coming together, but there is no plot to this book. It's just impressions. And that's what I really love about it, is the impressionism. We're almost getting to the end. But this was one way of knowing people, she thought, to know the outline, not the detail, to sit in one's garden and look at the slopes of a hill running purple down into the distant heather. She knew him in that way. She knew he had changed somehow. She had never read a line of his poetry. She thought she knew how it went, though, slowly and sonorously. It was seasoned and mellow. It was about the desert and the camel. It was about the palm tree and the desert. It was extremely impersonal. It said something about death. It said very little about love. There was an aloofness about him. He wanted very little of other people. So they talk about the awkwardness and such with the Cider Man. In the rough and tumble of daily life, with all those children about, all those visitors, one had constantly a sense of repetition, of one thing falling where another had fallen, and so setting up an echo which chimed in the air and made it full of vibrations. But it was a mistake, she thought. It was no monotony of bliss. She with her impulses and quicknesses, he with his shudders and glooms. So it's all about like the difference between like the moment versus the repetition, like the constancy, the merging, the separateness. One must hold the scene so, in a vice, and let nothing come in and spoil it. One wanted, she thought, dipping her brush deliberately, to be on a level with ordinary experience, to feel simply that's a chair, that's a table, and yet at the same time, it's a miracle, it's an ecstasy. The problem might be solved after all. But what happened? Some wave of white went over the window pane. The air must have stirred so flounced the room. Her heart leapt at her and seized her and tortured her. Mrs. Ramsay, Mrs. Ramsay. By this time, Mrs. Ramsay is dead, okay. Feeling the old horror come back. To want and to not to have. Could she inflict that still? And then, quietly, as if she refrained, that too became part of ordinary experience. Was on a level with a chair, with a table. Okay, here we get to the end of the book. But what did that matter, she asked herself. She looked at the steps, they were empty. She looked at her canvas, it was blurred. With a sudden intensity, as if she saw it clear for a second, she drew a line there, in the center. It was done. It was finished. Yes, she thought, laying down her brush in extreme fatigue. I have had my vision. So this might make like zero sense, going just quote after quote, but I think that this is the only way to like really enjoy the novel. I can't really explain the impressions that I have. I can just like go through the quotes and like experience them with you. It's more of an impressionistic novel than a realistic, than a novel that like tells a story. Rather, it's more like a feeling of a place and of ideas. Abstract. It's an abstract book. But I really, really liked it. And so I hope that you will like it too. And I will see you next time.